Hey everybody. I was recently having a conversation with the mom of Catholic YouTube, Hallie, about nominalism on my Discord, link down below. We were talking about what nominalism is and why it represents, to me at least, such a big obstacle on the road to Rome, so I thought I would dedicate a video to that. In this video, we're going to talk about 2 reasons why I think nominalism is true, 2 arguments against nominalism, and why I don't buy those arguments. We'll go over 1 bonus objection, and then we'll talk about what all of this means for the Catholic. Let's begin. Let's start with reasons why I think that nominalism is true. The first reason is going to be, perhaps anticlimactically, Occam's razor. I'm going to read from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about why Occam's razor is a good reason to think that nominalism is true. One argument against postulating abstract objects is based on Occam's razor. According to this principle, one should not multiply entities or kinds of entities unnecessarily. Thus, if one can show that concrete objects can perform the theoretical roles usually associated with abstract objects, one should refrain from postulating abstract objects. The effectiveness of this kind of appeal to Occam's razor is, of course, conditional upon our having been shown that concrete objects can play the theoretical roles associated with abstract objects. But if every theoretical role played by abstracta can be played by concreta and vice versa, then one needs a further reason why we should postulate concreta only rather than abstracta only. Sometimes the evidence for the existence of the abstracta in question is that they perform the theoretical role in question. In that case, one can use the principle that one should not postulate ad hoc entities or kinds of entities unnecessarily. That is, one should not postulate, if possible, entities for which there is no independent evidence, as in entities for the existence of which the only evidence available is that they satisfactorily perform a certain theoretical role. But Occam's razor isn't the only reason to think that nominalism is true. Another reason is something called the causality problem. Another common and widely discussed argument against abstract objects is an epistemological argument. The argument is grounded in the thought that given that abstract objects are causally inert, it is difficult to understand how we can have knowledge or reliable belief about them. Sometimes a similar argument is advanced according to which the problem with Platonism is that, given the causal inertness of abstract objects, it cannot explain how linguistic or mental reference to abstract objects is possible. Admittedly, these arguments do not conclusively establish nominalism, but if they work, they show an explanatory lacuna in Platonism. The challenge for the Platonist is to explain how knowledge of and reference to abstract objects is possible. Most of the debate with respect to this argument has concentrated on the particular application of the argument to the case of mathematical objects. Okay, so those are 2 reasons to think that nominalism is true, but now let's discuss 2 arguments to think that nominalism is false and why I don't buy those arguments. First, let's start with probably the most common objection: numbers. What about numbers? Under a nominalistic framework, it would be strictly speaking false to say that 1 plus 1 equals 2. That is to say, if 1, the abstracta, does not exist, then it couldn't be true that 1 plus 1 equals 2 because 1 doesn't exist and 2 doesn't exist. Well, I would like to go to a Majesty of Reason video and let an expert explain. This is philosophy professor Dr. Boyce.
I'll say something kind of shocking. Sometimes I like to say this sort of thing just for the shock value. I think it's strictly speaking false that 1 plus 1 equals 2. So why? Well, that claim entails the existence of 1 and the existence of 2. But if 1 and 2 existed, they'd be numbers and therefore abstract objects. But in my view, there aren't any such things. So it's just false that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Okay, but that sounds outrageous, right? Isn't it just like some obvious a priori truth that 1 plus 1 equals 2? I mean, even me, when I teach philosophy and I want to pull out an example of some obvious a priori truth, I might pull out 1 plus 1 equals 2. But here I think we have to be careful not to conflate the ontologically loaded claim that 1 plus 1 equals 2 with certain obvious logical truths in the neighborhood. So I do think it's strictly speaking true that whenever you have one thing and another thing and no other things besides those, then you've got exactly two things. I take that to be a nominalistically acceptable logical truth. It doesn't commit me to the existence of things like numbers. And I think in ordinary discourse, which I think includes a lot of loose talk, when people assert that 1 + 1 = 2, they aren't clearly distinguishing between the ontologically loaded mathematical claim at issue and the various nominalistically acceptable logical truths in the neighborhood. And finally, as a fictionalist, I believe that there being such logical truths in the neighborhood licenses us as pretending true that 1 + 1 = 2. And so it makes it acceptable for us to assert that claim, or at least quasi assert as much. So yeah, there are certain obvious a priori truths right in the neighborhood that make that claim assertable. I think that explains our sense that it's an obvious a priori truth.
Let's do one more objection. How about it's just common sense that abstract objects exist? It flies in the face of common sense to say that the color blue does not exist. Numbers don't exist. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. I don't think that common sense is a reliable pathway to true belief. It seemed like common sense that solid things were not mostly empty space, but we now know that they are. There are a whole slew of unintuitive truths that we have discovered are in fact true. And so I don't think that something being common sense is a sufficient reason to think that something is. Bonus objection. Well, Kevin, you talk as if nominalism was false. You talk as if universals exist. And yeah, I do. I'm going to quote a 2001 essay called Nominalism from Cornell. Let's take a look at section 2.1, Speak with the Vulgar, from the essay called Nominalism from 2001 from Cornell. Section 2.1 starts on page 12, and it's called Speak with the Vulgar. Now, they're not talking about vulgar as in dirty language or rude language or anything like that. When they say vulgar, the author is referring to the vulgate, the common tongue. According to nominalists, there's nothing wrong with serious utterances of sentence like Caesar uttered the same sentence over and over again, or the number of planets of the solar system is 9, or after the Jurassic period many dinosaur species went extinct, despite the fact that there are no sentences to be uttered twice, no numbers to count planets, and no species to go extinct. To bolster their case, they might point out, for example, that there is similarly nothing wrong with saying that the sun rises, sets, or moves above the meridian. We all say such things, even though most of us are no longer in the grips of Ptolemaic astronomy. We can think with the learned and speak with the vulgar. But the existence of a pragmatic paraphrase does not legitimize the use of the original sentence in all contexts, but it may do so in some where we're not concerned about certain entailments. The question is how? At this point, fictionalism comes to the rescue. Philosophers who are fictionalists about F's believe that the sentence that entail there are F's are literally false, but fictionally true. When we use literally false but fictionally true sentences, our practice is legitimate as long as it is clear in the context that we are immersed in the fiction, that we do not intend to question the constitutive assumptions of the fiction. When I utter Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep, my utterance is unobjectionable as long as it is clear that I merely recount how things are according to Homer's epic. The same sort of thing occurs, according to the fictionalist nominalist, when we utter, there are prime numbers larger than 100. The appropriate pragmatic paraphrase for the first sentence is, according to Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep. For the second sentence, according to the P&O arithmetic, there are prime numbers larger than 100. The fictionalist can provide paraphrases in a reasonably uniform fashion. The algorithm is roughly as follows. Suppose S is a sentence that carries commitment to abstract entities of a certain type. Suppose further that our best theory about entities of that type is T. Then the pragmatic paraphrase of S is, according to T, S. There are, of course, a number of problems with this. We don't know how to select T. We are not told what we should do if S carries commitments to more than one type of abstract entity. And most importantly, we don't have a precise understanding of according to T for arbitrary T. Nonetheless, this approach looks promising. Non-literal use is unquestionably a pervasive feature of natural language. Even in the middle of our most serious theoretical discussions, even when we are using a straightforward declarative sentences in a way that is indistinguishable from their assertoric use, we may in fact speak metaphorically, and we may in fact convey the content of some fiction. Still, when we do this, we tend to be aware, or at least easily made aware, that we are speaking figuratively. The surprising suggestion here is that in the philosophically interesting case that this is not so, we are wholly immersed in a fiction, and it takes serious reflection to notice that our words are not to be taken literally. According to the fictionalist nominalist, with regard to mathematics and other disciplines, deep into commitment to abstracta, we are much like children lost in the game of make-believe. So what does any of this have to do with Catholicism? Well, I think that nominalism does present some unique problems for Catholicism, but not for theism broadly. Remember Dr. Boyce from the Majesty of Reason video? He's a theist. He actually did a whole stream with the Analytic Christian about how theism and nominalism are compatible. But I will argue that nominalism is not compatible with Catholicism. The one example that I'll harp on is transubstantiation. Transubstantiation relies upon the existence of substances or essences, which are strictly rejected by the nominalist. If the particular of the bread remains the same, which I think all Catholics will admit, and the only thing that changes is the universal here, the substance, and universals don't exist, so substances don't exist, so nothing really changed, then, according to the nominalist, nothing changes under transubstantiation. And if a Catholic said that nothing changes during transubstantiation, I don't think that person is a Catholic in good standing. I think there's other problems too, like the statement sin exists would be strictly false, or grace exists would be strictly false under nominalism. I don't think that an Orthodox Catholic can say those things and remain an Orthodox Catholic. And it looks like Catholics don't disagree with me when I say that nominalism is not compatible with Catholicism. Here is an article from Catholic Answers called The Errors of Nominalism from 2005, in which they argue against nominalism, and they do insist that nominalism is not compatible with Catholicism. Nominalism and its friends, mereological nihilism and methodological naturalism, remain the largest obstacles on the path to Rome, at least in my opinion. Do you think that you have some knockdown argument against nominalism? Or maybe you have some understanding about how nominalism actually could coexist with Catholicism? If so, I want to hear from you. Leave me a comment down below, and I'd love to read and respond to any of your objections to my objections.